C, conscience, the beautiful soul, evil, and its forgiveness. The moral view of the world and its concepts proved untenable and contradictory, and thus collapsed. Concepts, namely, of a universal duty separated from the individual self and from an indifferent world and nature. The result is conscience, represented by Fichte and the Romantics, and whose self, qua knowing and willing, is the opposite of morality. That is, for conscience, there is no separation between duty and the self, and between morality and the world, nature. Both are one. This means that everything conscience does, all its actions, are good, right, and moral, provided, that is, that they are done with conviction. As Hegel says, quote, "In the will of the self that is certain of itself, in this knowledge that the self is essential being, lies the essence of what is right. All that is required is that conscience should know this and should state its conviction that its knowing and willing are right," end quote. Conscience, as a unity of universality, duty, and the self, individuality, also involves a community, a plurality of consciences, and reciprocal recognition. Quote, "Indeed, in calling itself conscience, it calls itself a universal knowing and willing which recognizes and acknowledges others and is the same as them, for they are just as pure self-knowing and willing, and is also recognized and acknowledged by them," end quote. Now, before we look at the dialectic's three moments, two things. First, a word about the origin of acting and judging conscience in what Hegel calls the beautiful soul, whose historical reference is the Romantic Novalis. In brief, the turning point for conscience occurs when its majesty and freedom of conviction, which allows it to put any content it pleases into its knowing and willing, becomes threatened, which happens at paragraph 648, when the other consciences of the universal community begin to become uncertain about the true motives of the spirit which does the action, and are forced to take it to be evil, end quote. When this happens, conscience withdraws into itself and no longer acts or engages with the world to avoid being judged as evil. Indeed, quote, "it now lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action and existence," end quote. It becomes a beautiful soul, which on the one hand is divine and godlike, a, quote, "moral genius which knows its inner voice to be a divine voice, and is in its own self divine worship, as its action is the contemplation of its own divinity," end quote. But on the other hand, in its stark isolation, it eventually becomes an unhappy lost soul, and, quote, "its light dies away within it, and it vanishes like a shapeless vapor that dissolves into thin air," end quote. But then, as Hegel says, this beautiful soul, quote, positively externalizes itself and moves onward. That is, by partitioning itself into an acting and a judging conscience. For example, this beautiful soul is in fact the simple concept that surrenders its eternal essence, its divine isolation, and is there in the real world and acts, end quote. Second, we must mention the importance of language or speech. Now, all that remains for conscience is that it have its conviction, as regards its duty, universalized or recognized in its concrete, knowing and willing self validated, which can only occur in a community of selves or moral beings. This brings us to language. For Hegel, the universal medium of recognition and also of spirit which immediately exists. Language is the universal medium of recognition because in it the self exists in a form in which it is at the same time for itself and for others. It is only through and because of its conviction in the form of an express utterance that an individual consciousness is able to announce and identify itself as conscious and universal. In the following, Hegel makes this quite clear. Quote, language or speech is self-consciousness existing for others. It is self-consciousness which as such is there, immediately present, and which in its individuality is universal. In language, the self becomes an object to itself, and at the same time fuses directly with others and is their self-consciousness. The self perceives itself at the same time that it is perceived by others, end quote. Language is the self existing in universal form. When I speak to you, I am consenting to open myself to objective being. I am asking to have my being recognized by another or by other selves. I am desiring to experience the enjoyment of seeing myself in another self, i.e., of being doubled. Language, then, is the medium in which the drama of the forgiveness of sins is acted out. And it is vital to keep this in mind, for otherwise it will not be understood why all interest hangs on whether one consciousness will offer a confession or admission to another or not. Spirit, for Hegel, only has meaning and reality in a community of self-conscious beings. It should also be pointed out that absolute moral justification and spirit, the result of this dialectic, both imply a state of being or consciousness free from evil and guilt, a state brought about by the fact that the wounds of the spirit heal without leaving any scars, end quote. It must be borne in mind that evil, for Hegel, consists simply in isolating oneself from the spiritual community, in holding to what is individual and particular as against the universal. With the resolution of the conflict between acting evil consciousness and judging good consciousness, comes the glorious freedom of knowing that one is always acting rightly, doing the good and performing what is universal. Thus, conscience, in its freedom to put any and every kind of content into the universal receptacle of pure duty and knowledge, becomes a beautiful soul. This type of conscience keeps to itself, aloof from others, and, quote, lives in dread of staining the radiance of its inner being by action and existence, end quote. It is the pure I equals I, which is a one-sided I equal I, in that it refuses to open itself to the objective being of recognition and language. In its most extreme form, the beautiful soul was self-annihilating and dissolved into thin air. In its less extreme form, it becomes judging consciousness or conscience, one of the two principal characters of the dialogue. The other leading role is played by acting consciousness or conscience. This is the type of conscience which desires to have its inner conviction regarding its alleged dutiful acts recognized as such by others. Acting conscience, in that each of its acts has upon it the stain of determinacy, will be stigmatized as evil by judging conscience, the conscience that judges but does not act. To summarize, acting conscience, styled evil by judging conscience and demanded to admit to its evil, will come to recognize not only its own self as evil, qua particular, but also that of judging conscience, which, due to the way it is constituted, also reveals itself as particular. Acting conscience, upon seeing evil in its opposite, will straightway confess its own evil in the expectation of a similar confession on the part of its opposite. Judging conscience will balk, holding to the stiff-necked attitude of the hard heart. But soon, after realizing the inherent contradictions of its own position, the latter will also yield its confession. This reciprocal act of confession, forgiveness, and justification will result in the coming into being of a state of universal equality of selves, the concrete realization of the I equals I, which Hegel will call absolute spirit and Reich Gottes. This dialectic has three moments. The first moment is occupied with exposing the hypocrisy alleged by judging conscience to exist in acting conscience, whose only desire is to have its inner conviction and concrete self recognized by others as good, dutiful, and universal. The struggle is one between individual and universal consciousness. Conscience, in its actions, has now become aware of the disparity between its conviction and its natural individuality, which supplies the content for its actions. Qua acting conscience, it tells others that its particular actions do correspond with its inner conviction of universal duty. But from their perspective, they only see in the former's actions a content which does not reflect them, which is not universal but particular. Hence, they call acting conscience evil against the universal. For acting conscience, individuality, action, and certainty of self are essential, while the universal is not. For judging conscience, or universal consciousness, the universal, i.e. duty, is essential, while individuality and action is not. Since acting conscience declares its act to be duty and conscientiousness, its opposite calls it hypocrisy. This hypocrisy must be unmasked. Inner and outer must be made to correspond. Hypocrisy, however, is not unmasked by judging conscience persisting in its judgment of acting conscience to be evil and base, for it can only appeal to its own inner law for its judgment in the same way that evil consciousness appeals to its law. For the reason that judging conscience's law makes its appearance in opposition to the law of acting conscience, the former's is a particular law. Hence it has no antecedent claim over the other, and in fact legitimizes it to boot. What it calls its true duty, which ought to be universally acknowledged, is something not acknowledged and recognized. Thus it stands in the same need of recognition, universalization, and validation in which the other does. Indeed, the upshot is that it shows itself to be hypocrisy. The second moment of the dialectic, marked by this sudden turnabout, will be concerned with pointing up the identity of the two consciences. It will be explicitly shown that judging conscience is constituted in the self-same way as acting conscience, that it too puts its phrases in place of duty. This will be followed by a confession of guilt on the part of acting conscience, which will signal the first moment of the reconciliation, which is absolute spirit. Through its own particular judgment, judging conscience puts itself on the same level as acting conscience, and the latter perceives this and knows that the former is also hypocrisy. Judging conscience says it is dutiful, but to be dutiful implies the performance of acts. As Hegel says, quote, "It is hypocrisy which wants to see the fact of judging taken for the actual deed," end quote. Judging conscience expects to be recognized as good and dutiful solely on the basis of its fine sentiments or words, not because of its acts or deeds. Acting conscience sees that its opposite is hypocrisy as well, and perceives the identity of the two. Also, judging conscience cannot deny what acting conscience holds by, namely that its specific deed is its duty, for duty only manifests itself in particular concrete cases. The point is, any and every act can be viewed as either dutiful or particular and selfish. The point is, any and every act can be viewed as either dutiful or particular and selfish. For example, quote, "If the act carries glory with it, then the inner sphere is judged as love of fame," end quote. And, quote, "Since in the act in general, the individual who acts comes to see himself in objective form, and thus attains enjoyment, the judgment on the act finds the inner nature of it to be an impulse towards personal happiness," end quote. Thus, since every action contains within it both particularity and universality, it can be viewed with equal warrant as moral and good or as private and base. Judging conscience, therefore, because of the fact that it holds to the particular aspect when it can just as well hold to the universal aspect of its counterpart's act is itself, by its judgment, base and mean. Furthermore, it is hypocrisy, because in giving its judgment, it does not admit to its own wickedness as being a judger without acts or deeds.